welcome back to the vlog. Thank you for rejoining me for the study on what is God like. Before I continue with what God was saying to Moses, I'd like to just explain what I said about a contradiction, that no man can see him and live. I find that contradictory, but I'm sure there are reasons for that. God doesn't lie, for a start, and we can see by looking at Genesis that God walked in the garden, so presumably Adam saw God and saw his face. I don't think they stood back to back while they talked and walked in the garden. Now there could be a reason for that. It could be that God manifested himself in a way that was acceptable to Adam. He could have manifested himself in the guise of a man, as he did with Abraham. That's perfectly possible. But the other time when God showed himself, as it were, and men saw him, was in Exodus 24, 9-11. Then went up Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and they saw the God of Israel, and there was under his feet, as it were, paved work of sapphire stone, and as it were, the body of heaven in his clearness. And upon the nobles of the children of Israel he laid not his hand. Also they saw God, and did eat and drink. As I said, God lays down the rules, but he doesn't live by them himself. He said, no man shall see my face, but he, under his mercy, he did show himself and withhold the punishment for seeing him. There was a price to pay for seeing God, but he withheld that under his mercy. We're beginning to understand God a little bit more, I hope. So let's continue with what God said to Moses. He said to Moses, I'm gracious, I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious. Now grace is an unmerited or undeserved favour. With our God, he imparts his very life to us. It's a gift out of his goodness. He said he was good, his goodness. But out of his goodness comes grace. We have no prior claim to expect that grace. Our very salvation, our very forgiveness is born out of God's grace. God said to Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. And that grace came to Paul as the power to endure all of his trials. Not just to endure, not just to get through, but it was power to endure with joy. Paul had joy in his heart, and he celebrated God every day. He rejoiced in his infirmities. So it's not just getting by, never with God. It's always overflowing. God used the term mercy. I will be merciful to those whom I show mercy. Mercy is, in a sense, easier to describe, because it's setting aside judgment. We deserve to be punished, but the mercy of God commits that. We're all judged to be guilty of sin, and the sentence is eternal death. However, out of God's grace, he extends mercy. He sets aside the judgment, because for the price of our the price of our sin has been paid by his Son, our Passover Lamb. In a courtroom, An advocate or barrister, as we call them in the UK, may appeal to the judge for clemency, another word for mercy. The judge, in response to the appeal, may deliver a lighter sentence. A very common way of doing this for less serious crimes is to give a suspended sentence. A suspended sentence means that over a given period, let's say a year, the sentence is withheld. The custodial sentence is withheld. And as long as that person behaves himself and does not commit the crime for which he is held up in court for, then that sentence is then wiped away. But woe betide him if he or her if he commits that crime within that period, because he will get that sentence that he was first awarded plus another sentence on the top of that, to run concurrently usually. Another way of giving a light sentence is to give a fine in lieu of a prison term. But please note, there's always a price to pay. There's never a free ride when you've done wrong. There's always a price to pay. I'll come back to that later. God says that he's long-suffering. It doesn't take a lot of explanation because the clues in the word itself, he's prepared to suffer for a long time. We don't know what a long time is because we are uncomfortable very quickly. If things aren't going our way, we soon start to squeal. Long-suffering is mixed with patience and endurance. God has the ability to set a time for himself on how long he will endure something. He told Abraham that the sin of the Amorites is not yet full, and it would take another 4 generations. The Bible tells us that God weighs everything in the balance. And when the time comes, the balance tips, and it's time for the next action, good or bad. I believe this is true of the trials we all face, incidentally. It doesn't go on forever if we're going through a trial, and I believe God sets the time, and because he's created everything. He's the ultimate mathematician. He's set everything in motion, and he set the time for our trials, and we come out of the trial better or worse than we were. That's the purpose of the trial. He doesn't give us a trial to be spiteful. He gives us a trial to see if that will change our hearts, to see if we'll come out softer, to see if we'll come out loving God more than we did when we went in. That's the purpose of the trial. I talk about this in my second book, so I'm going to leave that aside for now. God says he's abundant in goodness and truth. Well, we've discussed goodness, but the point he's making is that the goodness is in an abundance greater than we can measure. We can't calculate his goodness. We can't imagine how good he is. He is the origin of truth. His word is truth. Jesus is the word of God made flesh. Jesus is the truth. The truth is a person. That's our God. Abundant in truth, abundant in goodness. It mentions forgiving iniquity, transgression and sin. God forgives. But as I said earlier, there is a price very often. God forgave David for his part in the affair with Bathsheba, but there was still a price to be paid. David was forgiven, but God said the sword will never leave your house. How can you be forgiven and given a punishment? God doesn't play by our rules. Never forget that. God plays by his rules. He sets the rules. And even if he sets the rules for us, he doesn't play by the rules he set for us. And we'll discuss that at a further date. As part of the punishment to David, God said, I'll give your wives away, and people will witness it. The whole of Israel will know. Finally, your child will die. The child that he had with Bathsheba in his adultery, God sentenced to death as part of the punishment. Yet he was forgiven. And he was forgiven. He went on to be God's man, the man after God's own heart. And it's mentioned in the Bible several times that there was never a king like David. And God, many times, when kings came along that sinned against him, he said, I'm going to hold back. I'm going to hold back my judgment because of David. For the sake of David, I'm going to withhold. I'm going to stay my hand for a period at least to see what happens. Because he will be by no means clear the guilty. God's now showing the other side. He's showing his other side. We must never think that there's only one side to God, that he is benevolent and kind and good and long-suffering. There's another side to God. He will by no means clear the guilty. Now, God himself says that. He doesn't labour that point. That wasn't the time. He simply makes the statement, I will not forget the guilty. I will not let it pass. I will not let it escape me. No one will escape. My friend Morris says that no one gets away with anything. Whether you think you've got away with it or not. You know, there was a great scandal not so long ago in this country with a very famous man, Jimmy Savile. He was a very famous, and he was held in high esteem. He did work for charity. He was knighted for his work for charity, Sir Jimmy Savile. It transpired on his death that he was found to be the greatest, if you like, the most infamous paedophile that this country's ever seen. And one could have said that he'd got away with it. The law never caught up with him whilst he was alive. But I think we can safely say that God hasn't forgotten it. I don't want to go into that, but God doesn't miss anything. Later on, when God started to give Moses the rules for the Israelites living under his protection, he became very specific about punishment. And there were more curses than blessings for those who rebelled against him. There's a long, long list of punishments described by God in Deuteronomy 28. When I was a student doing an anatomy and physiology class, when we first came into the room, on every desk was a printed copy of Deuteronomy 28:22. Look it up. She was a non-Christian, our tutor, but she explained that Deuteronomy 28:22 describes perfectly the symptoms of tuberculosis. So even she had recognised that the Bible was correct, and that tuberculosis was a result of God's punishment. Well, I think we'll leave it there for now. We will be continuing the same subject in the next vlog, and I look forward to seeing you then. God bless you. We'll see you soon. Bye bye.